Hello, my little hillbillies. I had all this stuff written on the board the other day, and so I'm going through it very quickly for all y'all that want to see it. And so I'm going to go through it very quickly. And then the black part is what y'all are going to be learning about while I'm not there on both Thursday and Monday. So here we go. We know the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We talked about this, women in the war. When the men went off to fight in the war, women had to take all the jobs and responsibilities of all the men who went and fought. So they had to assume the responsibilities of all the men in the factories. They had to assume all the responsibilities of what the men were doing, financing the war for work, whether they were on the farm, whether they were a merchant, a banker, etc. And on top of it, women had to also continue doing the work that they had done before the war even started. So it was difficult. You had women who were also nurses, like Claire Barton. She's a founder of the Red Cross. They called her the Angel of the Battlefield. You had Jewish men and Jewish people involved in the war. Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederate the Confederate Secretary of War and Attorney General. He was on that $2 bill that I passed around in class, and people called him the brains of the war to Jefferson Davis. So he was considered Jefferson Davis's right-hand man. Being the Secretary of War, that means you're organizing the war efforts on paper. Being the Attorney General, that means you're in charge of all law. So Judah P. Benjamin, being the Confederate Secretary of War and Attorney General, means that he was practically the brains of the Confederacy. Now, I do like to point out that if you're a Confederate Jewish person fighting for slavery, it's kind of got to be a weird feeling. I mean, the Torah, Exodus and all that. It's got to be kind of a bizarre feeling, especially around Passover. So I just like pointing that out there. And General Orders number 11 were orders by General Grant to expel Jewish civilians from their homes and towns in Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi. And it was a way to show that Grant was not playing around with those who he felt were financing the war. Now, on top of that, Abraham Lincoln immediately saw that, immediately repealed it, because he realized that the religious freedom of the Jewish people were violated. It just was unacceptable that would be the case. It's 1862. The United States, the Union, is still fighting to put the Union back together, not to free the slaves. The Union is fighting to put the nation back as one, not to free the slaves. So in March of 1862 and September of 1862, we're going to see some significant events that will then lead to the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. So I'm going to check this out for you. So here we go. We're going to go to the document. And so what we had looked at were the ironclads, right? So what we had done is we had spent some time looking at the ironclads. I'm going to move this into the screen. Sorry. So, gosh darn it. Son of a biscuit. Oh, for coming on. What in the heck? Okay, here we go. So we've got the ironclads, the Merrimack and the Monitor. And these two ironclads were unlike anything else anyone had ever seen in naval warfare. They were now boats that were cut off from the top, and they were bolted and plated with iron. The Merrimack being the Confederate ship that had the guns that were fixed in position, and the Monitor that had only two guns, but the two guns could rotate into a turret in a revolving act. Gosh darn it. They could move around in a revolving. There we go. I think I got it. There we go. Oh, come on. Whatever. Y'all understand the picture. Whatever. The Monitor, the Union battleship, was a big deal because now it was completely made of iron, and it could fire in all directions, even though it only had two guns. Now, as you saw in the video, it said, all navies on Earth are now obsolete. These two ironclads were indestructible, period, plain and simple. They are ships that have guns on them, and they cannot be destroyed. So all of the world saw in awe and just disbelief that the United States of America, let alone that, the Confederate States, created the first ironclad, and now all navies would never be able to compete because they were all wooden ships. And wooden ships just cannot compete with iron ships. That's just the way it was. In September of 1862, Robert E. Lee decided to test the Union. He invaded Maryland, thinking that it would be a good idea to prove to Maryland that he could be the liberator of the state of Maryland from Union territory. Now, as I have on the board here, it says the following. When he invades Maryland to capture Washington, D.C., he doesn't need to. All Robert E. Lee needs to do is play defense. Something the Boston Celtics are not doing right now as I'm watching the game because they're down 5 to Oklahoma City. Anyways, Robert E. Lee invades Maryland, but he doesn't need to. And they meet in a small town of Maryland, Sharpsburg, Maryland, where it becomes one of the most horrific days in American history. The battle starts in the cornfield. By mid-morning, 7,000 men killed or wounded. It was mass slaughter. It ends up being the bloodiest day in American history, still is today. 22,717 recorded casualties in 12 hours of fighting. That's practically 2,000 people being killed or wounded an hour. It was unbelievable. The Union lost 12,400 men. The Confederacy lost 10,300 men. But because the Union had 87,000 men and the Confederacy had 45,000 men, Lee lost just under a fourth of his military, and the Union did not lose nearly as many in terms of the size. So it ended up being a Union victory. Now, it's not all necessarily what happened at Antietam that made it a big deal, but the fact that Mathew Brady photographed Antietam. Now, if we haven't read this in class yet or whatnot, y'all got to go to the website. Y'all got to watch this. Yes, I understand and proceed. Yeah, that's yes. All right, I didn't want to see it. That's enough. So my block 4 and my block 7, y'all need to watch this video for sure about the dead of Antietam, because what Mathew Brady did was he shocked the nation by showing what the war actually looked like. In October 1862, Mathew Brady opened up an exhibition in New York, in downtown New York City, and he called it The Dead of Antietam. And what he did was he took actual graphic photographs of the battles and put them on display. And as you read through this, you're going to see just how horrific this exposure to the war was. The nation had never seen anything like this. Yes, they have read about the bodies. Yes, they had read about the battles, but they actually are now seeing photographs of dead young men and soldiers, physically seeing the horrificness of the war and how horrible it was. I don't think horrificness is a word, by the way, but I'm just going to go with it. What I want y'all to do now, too, is I want you all to watch this Emancipation Proclamation flick. And I want you to realize the following, too. Again, Abraham Lincoln did not mean to free the slaves. That was not the objective when the war started. But because of the Battle of Antietam, the Union thought, you know what? Maybe it is time to free the slaves, but only in the states in rebellion. When you read this proclamation, Abraham Lincoln says, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state where the people shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall thenceforward be forever free. What Lincoln is saying is, if you're a slave in the Confederacy, you're liberated, you're emancipated. But there are about 500,000 slaves living in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri. They are not freed, because if Lincoln frees the slaves in the Union too, well then, won't the Union states secede? And then it really won't be just, the war will then be about slavery. So you got to read through about that. We get to 1863, which is the turning point. In 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg, ends up being the most horrific 3 days of the war. 53,000 men were killed or wounded in 3 days in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Y'all got to read about this, which then takes you down here. You don't have to watch the video about Pickett's charge unless you're really bored, but just to give you an idea, George Pickett on the third day led a group of 7,000 Confederates across the field where every single one of them was killed. And that is what decided the battle. 7,000 Confederate soldiers marched across a grass field and were slaughtered, just simply slaughtered by Union soldiers, where Robert E. Lee's men had to retreat, and it ended up being a victory for the United States, and it was considered the turning point of the Civil War. While that's going on in 1863, Ulysses S. Grant is at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and you're going to read all about him bombarding Vicksburg, Mississippi, and you're going to see here just how horrible the living conditions were in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where people, they legit dug holes in the ground and lived in them underground. So It was just awful. So you'll read about Vicksburg and how awful it was. And then finally, the Gettysburg Address, where you're going to read about the Gettysburg Address. And then there's a video here about the Gettysburg Address I want you to watch. The biggest thing out of the Gettysburg Address was one phrase that Abraham Lincoln said. It wasn't, and it's highlighted in here, but I want you to watch the video and then listen to the speech. Because when Lincoln says 77 years ago, he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. He's saying that all men are created equal. That was in the Declaration of Independence. And then when he talks at Gettysburg, he mentions that this is about the men who have fought on the battlefield, and that these are the men that have hallowed the ground, that the fallen soldiers are the ones that have dedicated Gettysburg to the nation. And the phrase that changes the entire nature of the war is when Abraham Lincoln says that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom means now we are freeing the slaves. That this is about the slaves being freed. So now the new birth of freedom means the nation is going to be a nation without slavery. It changes the nature of the war. And so we see that when Abraham Lincoln writes the Gettysburg Address, that the war is not only about just putting the nation back together, but it's also about freeing the slaves. At that point, you're going to get down here to William Tecumseh Sherman. You're going to watch the video about William Tecumseh Sherman and read all about William Tecumseh Sherman. He's like my favorite guy in the Civil War. I love him because he burns everything. You're going to then read about Andersonville Prison and how it was one of the most horrific, awful prisons ever in all of American history. Abraham Lincoln giving his inaugural address, and the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant. And then finally, the end of the war and Johnny Wilkes Booth not messing around. You'll watch this video about Lincoln's assassination. Y'all have some questions that you need to answer that I posted on the website, and they are due by the end of the day, Monday. So y'all got work to do today on Friday, and y'all got work to do on Monday. And then when you're done with the work, when you're done with the Civil War stuff, y'all begin the Reconstruction writing assignment, which is posted on the website. I'll see y'all when I get back from New York, and be good.